Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Royal Society of Edinburgh Investigates Conservation Series. My name is David Field. I am the CEO of the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, which leads both Edinburgh Zoo and the Highland Wildlife Park. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to this particular event. The RSC Investigates Conservation Series is looking at so many areas and so much work that's being done to protect and repair our natural resources. And also having the opportunity to hear from some of the many incredible people that are dedicating themselves to the conservation of our planet. Throughout this series, we are exploring the vast and varied work being done in this area from Scotland and globally. But also very clearly, we're using this series to challenge those thoughts, to challenge that work, to invite you to explore some of the very tricky and difficult questions and difficult scenarios which we're all trying to face in trying to repair this work. So I really hope you enjoy the whole series. There's plenty going on, and really do invite you very much to bring your questions and your thoughts throughout this series. This particular event is one which is very, very exciting because we are talking about the work that has been done to restore or begin the restoration of the wildcat to Scotland. It's an incredibly exciting time. This is the first conservation translocation of a carnivore in the UK, a real moment, a moment to be very proud of, a moment to really celebrate because we can and we are repairing that natural habitat. But there's going to be other people who will tell you far more about this than I, and I'm going to be delighted to introduce you to those people in a few moments. But as I said, although there'll be a fantastic lecture, we really, really encourage you to submit questions. And please put your questions throughout the event using the Q&A function throughout. I would really like to introduce you to the two people which will be hosting the event. There'll be Gemma Wright from the Saving Wildcats team, who will be hosting the question and answer session later on. But primarily, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Helen Senn, who is the head of conservation and science at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. Helen is a geneticist by background, but has devoted her time, her work, her passion towards the conservation of species. Helen is leading not just the restoration of the wildcat project, but so much other work of conservation at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, from working with desert antelopes through to the restoration of pine hoverflies and some of our newer projects, which include moths and leeches. But today, we're focused on the wildcats, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Helen Senn. Helen, please.
Thanks very much, David, for that great introduction. And I'm just going to have a momentary faff while I share my screen with everybody. Hopefully you can all see that. So my job is to be Head of Conservation and Science at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. And I'm also the project lead for the Saving Wildcats project. And the Saving Wildcats project is a project that's led by RZSS, but it's also a big partnership project. And our key partners are the Cairngorms National Park Authority, Nature Scot, Forestry and Land Scotland, Nordens Ark in Sweden, and Junta de Andalucía, which is the government of Andalucía in Spain, which leads the Iberian Lynx Reintroduction Project. And hopefully what I'm going to talk to you about today will persuade you that really what it takes to recover a species is a big collaborative effort. And some of you, I've put this picture up because I'm going to hazard a guess that probably not that many of you have seen a wildcat in the wild, but I think it's probably also likely that some of you have seen this very exact picture of a wildcat, which is lovely. And that's because basically there's not many cats left. And that's why we're at this point where we need to recover the species. And what I'm going to talk about today is really what it might take to recover a species that's on the brink of extinction like this. And hopefully really provide, in a way, a bit of a salutary lesson in why we shouldn't allow things to get this far, and why rowing back from the brink of extinction is complex and success isn't guaranteed, and critically why therefore it needs a big collaborative community effort to hopefully get there in the end. So a little bit more about wildcats. They're our last living wild felid. They're threatened with a range of different things, but habitat loss and persecution, and more recently, hybridisation. And it's difficult to get population estimates for the species in the wild. The official estimates are around 100 to 300 individuals, and they're classed as critically endangered. But those estimates are really complicated by hybridisation, and we'll come on to that a bit more in a moment. I mean, captive breeding is one of the answers to help with the recovery of this species. And there's a lot of ingredients that are going to need to go into this, and I'm going to get to those in a moment. And there's 150 cats at the moment in captivity, approximately, spread across around 30 different institutions. So that's a sort of few facts about wildcats. And in this talk, I'm going to cover really how we've got to where we are today and what we need to do going forwards to hopefully secure the recovery of this species. So meet the wildcat, the European wildcat, which is spread in Britain, but also across Europe. And it's a species that likes to live in complex, mixed forest and grassland habitat, which obviously we've now lost quite a lot of in Scotland over the last centuries. So historically, one of the big threats facing wildcat is habitat loss, and then following that, really a high level of persecution for the species. And really by the end of the 19th century, the wildcat has really become nearly extinct. So it was once found all across mainland Britain, and now it's been driven by that point back to very small populations, to a low point probably around 1915. There was a certain amount of expansion of that population during World War I, where persecution reduced and reforestation happened. And probably the recent population peak is within the mid-20th century, and then further declines as threats re-established, probably particularly increased efficiency of persecution using novel technologies. And the wildcat wasn't legally protected until 1988. And one of the things that threatens wildcat, these small populations of wildcats, is interbreeding or hybridisation between wildcats and domestic cats. They're two very separate species. They're separated by around 1 million years of evolutionary history, but the offspring are viable and fertile, and hybrids can breed with either parent species, something that we call backcrossing. And so what's really happened is a kind of cryptic extinction of the species. We use a number of different methods to understand how hybridisation is happening. We've used different methods over time. One of the key methodologies, which was developed by the National Museum of Scotland and Andrew Kitchener, is looking at the pelage traits, different characteristics in the fur patterns. And this is still a tool that's used very importantly in the field most of the time today. And genetic research has really given us an insight into what's going on with wildcat hybridisation. And this is research that's been led in part by the RZSS Wild Genes Lab, but also a great collaboration with the University of Bristol. And what that's shown is that a number of things. One is that hybridisation is very widespread in wild living cats in Scotland. And the other is that hybridisation has really escalated from the 1960s onwards. So Scotland has a very recent hybrid swarm population. And really hybridisation is a consequence of small population size and not a cause of small population size. In fact, it could potentially be argued that wildcats are only here because of their ability to hybridise with domestic cat. And really, from the 1980s, 1990s onwards, people became quite concerned for the first time about the decline of wildcat. And there was a whole lot of research that was done into why that might be, research on behaviour and habitat use, diet and genetics. And it wasn't until 2010, really that the first targeted conservation activities happened on the species. First of all, with the Highland Tiger Cairngorms Wildcat project, and then following on from that in 2015 with the Scottish Wildcat Action project. And critically, the Scottish Wildcat Action project really was the first attempt to bring all of the key stakeholders in wildcat conservation for Scotland around the table to come up with a plan and to attempt to find a solution for the species recovery. And that work was focused on priority areas that were sites that were identified as being potential strongholds for wildcat populations. And the idea of that project was to try and halt the decline using what we call in-situ action or conservation in the wild, primarily by doing trap, neuter, vaccinate release of feral domestic cats, and really trying to also lay a strong scientific foundation for what was going on with wildcats in the wild. And in parallel, a role that RZSS had was to manage the captive breeding population as a potential tool for future recovery, as an insurance backup in the event that things in the wild were not in a suitable state for recovery to happen on its own. And the reports from this project have recently been published and are available on the Nature Scot website. But partway through the project, it was really clear to the partnership, and it was a large partnership of organisations, that things weren't right. So there weren't as many wildcats out there as people had perhaps first thought. And an independent review was was conducted by the IUCN Species Survival Commission's Cat Specialist Group in 2019, which looked at the available evidence at that point and concluded that the population is no longer viable, meaning that even if there are still individuals living in the wild, they're unable to form a self-sustaining population. So in short, really, wildcats were found to be too few, too widely distributed, and too hybridized to recover without outside help. And the conclusions from that report was that without urgent action on a number of different fronts, wildcats would be lost forever from Britain. And that was really how the Saving Wildcats project was then started. And the vision for that project is to try to start the process of recovery of wildcats to landscapes across Scotland, but acknowledging very much that we need to start that, first of all, on a small scale, and that we need to get that right, and that critically a science-based and an evidence-based approach to recovery is extremely important in allowing us to then understand what a future strategy might be. And it's a European partnership project funded by the EU LIFE programme. And it's a project that brings together a large number of partners and critically tries to learn from species recovery projects, both in Europe and internationally, in order to try and come up with the best approach for trying to prevent the extinction of this species in Scotland. And the key tool to doing that is to breed and release the animals into the wild whilst doing very careful monitoring and threat mitigation in the wild habitat. And the project really has, it's kind of a project of two halves. There's a first part, which is a preparatory part, which operates on two fronts. So the first aspect of that is everything to do with ensuring that the site in the wild is as suitable as possible for release, and understanding as much as we can about the baseline situation. And the other part is about preparing a captive breeding population to a point where it's suitable for reintroduction into the wild. And those 2 points come together into the trial release, which has actually just started to happen now. So we're at a very exciting point in this project, with the idea that we will learn as much as we can from the release, conduct monitoring and evaluation, and use that to inform future releases of wildcats into the wild. And our approach is informed by a whole variety of different projects and stakeholders, but probably critically for those of you that are interested in species recovery as a discipline, the IUCN guidelines provide some really, the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, provides some really important guidelines, both for planning species recovery, the use of captive populations in species conservation and the use of reintroductions and conservation translocations as a recovery tool, and how that fits into really conservation best practice. And I really recommend those guidelines. And we're very lucky in Scotland as well that we have our own version of the IUCN reintroduction guidelines, which is the Scottish Code for Conservation Translocations. And a lot of what we have done within the project so far has been about making sure that we're in line with that conservation translocation guideline, and also critically within Scotland, all projects like this require a conservation license, a translocation license, which requires evidencing a range of aspects on the conservation translocation guidelines. So the Saving Wildcats project team is quite large. It reflects the need to operate in this kind of project with two separate kind of disciplines: the field team and the captive management, or the ex-situ team. And it's obviously informed as well by our partnership. So just a little bit more about the project aims. So the first aspect of this project, which is conservation breeding. So in order to make sure that the conservation programme for wildcats is in a suitable state for reintroduction in the wild, we first established a conservation breeding centre at Highland Wildlife Park. This is off-show to the general public at the back of the park, and it's a large facility which allows us to select suitable animals from the UK's conservation breeding programme, which is comprised of over 30 different zoos and wildlife parks across the UK, a very diverse array of institutions, and which holds approximately 150 animals at any one point in time. Cats were chosen to be part of the breeding population and paired in breeding enclosures. And it's the kittens from those pairings that are then released into the wild. This is just an aerial view of the breeding centre. And down in the left-hand corner, these are the breeding enclosures, which have a fine mesh gauge. And then on the upper right-hand side, there's the open-topped conservation breeding for release enclosures, which are much larger and have naturalistic habitat within them, and a whole variety of different enrichment, what we call enrichment tools, or stimulating things like climbing structures. And this model is very much informed by our partnership with the Junta de Andalucía, who have led one of the most successful carnivore or felid reintroduction projects, recovery projects that's happened globally. And we've modelled the breeding centre very much on the Iberian lynx breeding centres that are found within Spain and Portugal. And obviously the objective of the breeding centre is to have kittens. So just a little bit of an example of some of the outcome of the breeding pairings. So these are some kittens that are part of the breeding programme. And these kittens are then moved to the pre-release enclosures prior to release, where they spend a number of months in those enclosures. The whole facility is observed really closely using CCTV camera technology, and that really allows us to get a good view on the wildcat's behaviour. So this is an example of one of the pre-release enclosures with the climbing structures inside it, and looking into both the breeding and the pre-release enclosures using CCTV technology. And we're working together with the Royal Veterinary College at the University of London in order to establish our behavioural monitoring methods using a combination of scans and continuous sampling based on the video data. And this provides evidence for a pre-release checklist, including looking at things like the activity pattern and the enclosure use within the enclosures, using behavioural analysis, looking at hunting behaviours and keeper interactions. And this is an example of the sorts of observations that we're able to make through this facility, so able to follow and observe cats' behaviour quite closely. And really one of the challenges of this setup is deciding how much time to spend watching the cats, because the camera facilities are really, really powerful. The second part of the project is all about preparing and ensuring that the release site is suitable for the wildcats. And there's a wide range of different activities that have taken place in order to complete this part of the pre-release assessment. I'm not going to be able to cover all of them here, but broadly speaking, it involves assessing the release site for ecological and social surveys, preparing the release site, making sure that threats have been identified and mitigated as far as possible, and monitoring the release site. We're very fortunate to be partnering with Cairngorms Connect, which is a fantastic partnership project, a bold and ambitious 200-year vision to enhance habitat species and ecological processes, and a collaboration between Wildland, the RSPB Scotland, Forestry Land Scotland, and Nature Scot. And this is the site that's been chosen as the site for wildcat release. 70% of the area is covered by international nature conservations designations, formerly Natura sites, and there's suitable wildcat habitat in 220 kilometres squared of the lower ground. And so this is the area where the releases are taking place. In the last 3 years, we've run a variety of activities across the site, particularly focused on camera trap surveys to look at the presence of wild living cats, prey species, other competing mesocarnivores and other protected species. And in total, the team have analysed over 1.2 million camera trap images from a large array of cameras that's placed across the site. The team also conduct dedicated prey surveys, and we conducted an extensive baseline survey in year 1, and that's now being followed up by annual monitoring that will also follow on during the course of the releases. The camera trap survey follows a standardised design. It has camera traps over 100 cameras sited across the site, and the abundance and distribution of all of the species that are detected is recorded. And this is a sort of example of data that can come out of this kind of analysis. And so very useful to be able to understand the general context into which we're releasing these cats, which of course formerly were part of our natural complement of carnivores within the environment, and an ecosystem which is actually now very much depleted of species. The field team have also been working on small mammal surveys across the site, a whole variety of different species, but particularly this is some data that's been generated in collaboration with the Cairngorms Connect Predator Project, which is a long-term project that predates our species of introduction project, to look at the presence of small mammals, of voles. And the field team are also running surveys on rabbits and water voles across the release site to help us understand the long-term trends and suitability. A really important part of the release site assessment is assessing the threat from other wild living cats. And our camera trap survey suggests that there's very low numbers of feral or hybrid cats and the release site, which is actually one of the reasons why it was selected in the first place. And cats are mainly concentrated around the farms or the edge of human settlements. And the team spend an extensive amount of time speaking to local people to understand whether cats that have been identified are owned or whether they're feral. And a lot of work goes into creating what we call the catalogue, which is really a kind of ID of all living cats that are moving and breathing within the release site. And any cats that are found that are feral and unneutered are targeted as part of our Trap, Neuter, Vaccinate, Return programme, which is the national strategy for feral cat control and was also used during Scottish Wildcat Action. And it's a really critical tool to reduce hybridisation and disease transfer in wildcats, and which are conducted under licence from Nature Scot. Feral cat traps are set if there's a target cat has been found, and their cats are health checked. When they're trapped, they're health checked, neutered and vaccinated by a vet, and then returned to the site. And the team are working very closely with Cats Protection on this, who've done a huge amount of work in this area over many years. And we're also taking really critically to inform kind of ongoing research, disease samples for genetic testing, samples for disease testing and genetic testing. And across the release site, we're also encouraging people, continuing with responsible cat ownership messaging, encouraging people to neuter, vaccinate, and microchip their cat, which is making it a super cat. And that's a campaign that's been ongoing since Scottish Wildcat Action. A really critical part of this project is understanding and communicating with everyone who lives in and around the release site, because everybody who lives in and around the release site, who lives cheek by jowl with wildcats, is a future stakeholder in their safety and in the recovery of the population. And the project team spent a lot of time speaking to people. This has been quite challenging because obviously over the last few years, doing face-to-face communication has been considerably hampered by COVID. And so we started our engagement with online webinars, which definitely had their limitations. We've done postcard drops to every single person living in and around the release site, and asked them about their attitudes to responsible cat ownership and wildcat restoration in the local area. And on the whole, it's great to know that responses have been very positive, but it's also allowed us to really address people's concerns head on as well. And there's a whole variety of other drop-in sessions and engagement activities have been held with the local community, so far over 60 in total, and that's always continuing to grow, whether that's speaking to local school groups, talking to local ranger teams, or attending game fairs, or holding dedicated drop-in sessions. There's a lot of businesses within the local area that are stakeholders in the wildcat, and we are always keen to speak to them and communicate with quite a number of them, because it's really important that the recovery of this species is able to benefit as many people locally as possible. We've also run a lot of drop-in and informal interviews with landowners in and around the release site. So within the wider release area, we've spoken to over 50 different landowners in the wider project area, and really to talk to them about their concerns around identification, predation of ground nesting birds, and how wildcats on their land might operate with ongoing predator control activities that they can conduct legally. And there's clearly, as we know, there's definitely risks to wildcats from predator control. And so the team have been spending time engaging and talking to a wide variety of landowners of that. And our approach is to try and ensure that we have as good communication and awareness raising as possible to minimise the risks to wildcats. These two elements of the project came together really only a few weeks ago when we started the first trial release of cats into the Cairngorms Connect site, which was a really exciting moment, but it's definitely the beginning of the next phase of the project, and certainly not the end of the project by any stretch of the imagination. Our approach is to do what's called a soft or delayed release. So wildcats are moved to small enclosures at the release site and then released from there. And the release period is, as I said, started in June and is ongoing until September 2023. And really this coincides with peak prey availability and the lowest chance of road mortality because of the hours of daylight. The cats are at this point 12 to 18 months old and are old enough to have GPS collars fitted to them, which is a really critical part of our post-release monitoring activities. And the cats are released in several release cohorts. And the team are now working on a whole variety of different post-release monitoring activities. As mentioned, the GPS collars, but camera trapping, scatter analysis, and gathering sightings information, and a whole variety of other things. The collaring approach has been tested before under Scottish Wildcat Action, where it was used to monitor wildcat hybrids across a number of different sites within Scotland. And the data is stored on the collars and then downloaded manually in the field. And we're anticipating being able to track cats for up to 9 months before the collars will then be removed. So that's really where we're at with the project. So a really exciting moment, but a lot to learn now going forwards, using a very evidence-based approach. We're hoping to release approximately 20 cats in 2023, and then that will be followed by 2 further releases of approximately 20 cats in the subsequent years. And really everything now is geared to trying to understand whether wildcats will establish successfully at the release site and what factors might be able to influence success. We know that life in the wild for carnivores is tough, and we know that not every wildcat will survive. The survival rate for carnivores in the wild are not generally high in nature anyway. So there's lots of challenges, and I think those that are scientists amongst you will also see that it's very difficult with all of these reintroduction projects on threatened species to get to a state of statistical certainty with very small sample sizes that we have to operate with. But at the end of the day, what really matters is whether or not we're able to establish a successful reproducing viable wildcat population. And what we're trying to do is use the best available evidence to stack as many things in that population's favour, and then learn as much as we can as we go along to inform future releases. And this is just a video of one of the first cats that was ever released back to mainland Britain in the first release of wildcats. And this happened just a couple of weeks ago. So a really exciting moment for the project. So as I mentioned, it's a huge partnership project. We've got lots of supporters that we're extremely grateful for, and a lot of organisations that are contributing to maintaining the captive breeding programme of wildcats, which is a critical insurance population for future wildcat conservation efforts, perhaps not just here in Scotland, but also in Wales and England in the future. And we're very grateful to a large number of advisors and collaborators who are helping us with a very interdisciplinary project or discipline of species reintroductions, which really relies on taking scientific data from a whole range of disciplines, whether that's genetics, ecology, veterinary science, and the like. We're very grateful for the input of all our volunteers. And if you want to stay in touch with the project, then we do have a dedicated website, and you can sign up to the project newsletter. If you want to support us, there's lots of different ways of doing that. If you're a co-op member, you can even sign up to donate your points to us, and you can sponsor a cat in the breeding centre. And yeah, staying in touch with the newsletter if you're interested in volunteering opportunities via email. At OZSS, as David mentioned, we're working on a number of different species recovery projects. And 2 of my colleagues, Dr. Alex Ball and Dr. Helen Taylor, recently gave other talks in this series about some of the other species recovery work we do, and I urge you to go and check those out. So thanks very much for listening. And I will now stop sharing my screen and start taking some of the questions, I think. Great. So I can see there's quite a lot of different questions that have come in from different people. Colin is asking, do you see this as being part of an ongoing programme, or is there an endpoint to the project? And if the latter, then what does success look like? So that's a really great question, Colin. So as I mentioned, obviously we're planning to release, for the moment, we're planning to release wildcats over the course of 3 years. I think realistically, we don't think we're probably going to be done with needing to release wildcats by that point. If we imagine that really what we'd like to get back to is populations of wildcats across Scotland. So I think in terms of that ultimate success, what we're looking at is doing further releases at other sites, at sites hopefully that can be interconnected over a longer time scale. In the short term, what we're looking for in terms of success is a population that maintains at the release site, that's reproducing and able to maintain, I guess, a viable population without a level of outside support. But I think realistically, even that is going to take a number of years. And we know from other recovery projects that generally speaking, you're looking at, kind of timescale of 5 to 10 years plus in order to successfully re-establish a species of this nature. I'm just having a look at some of the other questions. So Robert's asked, how endangered are wildcats in Europe? So wildcats are threatened actually in many different populations within Europe, but there are also some healthy populations. So certainly the situation in Scotland is the most severe because we have the smallest population and also the highest levels of hybridisation. And there's some much healthier populations of wildcats in both, for example, northern Spain and Germany. I think it's fair to say that there are threats facing all wildcat populations across Europe, and probably the threat of hybridisation is one that's not particularly well understood, and perhaps there's some sense that people don't always take notice of that until things are quite far down the line. Amy is asking, is habitat connectivity important? Are they wide roaming, and do they need a patch of land that's X hectares size, for example? So yeah, the habitat connectivity is absolutely critical. And I think this is a real theme for species conservation in general, is that it's not just having a pocket of habitat, but it's thinking about how different pockets of habitat are interconnected. So in terms of the release site, that should be large enough to support, in theory, a small population of wildcats. It could be self-sustaining, but of course that's the theory, and any kind of breakup in habitat connectivity increases the level of threat as well. Can increase the contact with things like roads and obviously human settlements. And so I think for a lot of conservation issues in Scotland, reconnecting habitat is a really big theme, and it's actually one of the great reasons for doing this project within the Cairngorms Connect landscape, because of the 200-year commitment to trying to improve habitat connectivity and recovery, and a lot of progress has been made on that front already. Is persecution, so somebody, anonymous has asked, is persecution still an issue, or do you see hybridisation as the main threat? I think persecution is very much still an issue. There's many aspects of predator control that can be quite indiscriminate. And so wildcats can still be persecuted in that way. And so we still find that a very concerning situation. I think hybridisation is really a threat when populations become very small, and that's certainly the situation that we're in right now, and it's certainly going to be an ongoing issue for any re-establishing wildcat population. So I think I'd see both of those threats as being serious and ones that we need to very much factor into our recovery strategy. Are wildcats vaccinated before release, and do they have pit tags so they can still be identified even after their GPS collars are removed. So yes, there's a whole range of things that we look at. We do with the wildcats before they're released, and certainly vaccination. So there's a whole set of vaccinations and healthcare activities that happen in our veterinary centre before the wildcats are released. And each cat is also microchipped, so that we can identify it once the collars have been released, been removed. Also, the catalogue that we're using to look at the individual cats' IDs will also help us to identify the cats visually from camera trap footage. Another question: if the project is successful, it would be great to see it rolled out across a wider geographical area. But what are the prospects for funding this, given that the UK has now left the EU, i.e. no more life funding? So that's a very challenging question. One that we're not quite sure really that we have the answer to right now, because of course we're still in the first phase of the project. We're very fortunate to receive a very large grant from the European Union to start this project, and the LIFE funding stream has funded other similar species recovery projects across Europe, and it's a really great grant for funding and driving kind of quality projects, the quality of projects like this. There's no doubt that for a second phase of project of a similar scale, we're going to need to find a significant amount of funding. Part of our current activities are around ensuring that we have a sustainable funding stream in place when we finish the end of the project. And we have a whole range of different supporters and funders. And just a little plug, if you want to support us, you can obviously, there's a variety of ways you can donate to the project. LJ would like the links to the other talks to be shared, but I can see somebody's already on that. Do you think the success of wildcat recovery could be used in future to help argue for the reintroduction of other carnivores to Scotland, like the wolf or lynx? So that's Christine Damask. Thank you very much for that question, Christine. I'm not sure about whether it could help argue for the species reintroduction, but I think what's really clear is that a lot of species reintroduction methods have a lot of parallels. They're very interdisciplinary in nature. There's a lot of similar steps that you need to go through in order to try and construct a reintroduction project. And so we hope very much that in the way that we've learned from the Iberian Lynx project, that other people will learn from the wildcat reintroduction project, and sharing our experiences is a really big part of what we want to do. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about reintroduction of wildcats, not just in Scotland, but at other parts of the UK, and perhaps in future as well, some of these methods might be used in Europe. Somebody's asking about how genetically distinct Scottish wildcat populations are from European populations. So they're the same species. They are a distinct subpopulation, but not a huge genetic difference between the two species, the two populations. And actually, one of the plans for future wildcat releases is to incorporate animals from mainland Europe into the conservation breeding programme, so that we can boost the gene pool a bit and ensure that we have high levels of genetic diversity in the wildcat release, because genetic diversity is good for allowing populations to adapt to future challenges like disease and climate change. Sarah's asking, how does the Scottish Wildcat Project differ from the Iberian Lynx breeding programme? Well, there's a lot. Obviously, I've talked about some of the parallels. I think actually one of the interesting differences is, apart from them being on two different species in two different countries, is that with the Scottish Wildcat Project, we were lucky to have the insurance population for wildcats in captivity already established. So that had been, over the last few decades, a number of different organisations and institutions had collaborated together in order to establish the Scottish wildcat breeding programme, which meant that when we came to a point of wanting to start planning a release, there were already a significant number of cats in captivity. And what we did during the Scottish Wildcat Action Project, so from 2015 to 2019, was we really, RZSS led on managing the breeding programme, and we were able to build up the numbers of wildcats in captivity. At that point, there were around 70 wildcats in captivity, and we've built them up to the sort of population size of 150 today, and to do a lot of background work on the captive breeding programme, including establishing the level of hybridisation in the breeding programme and establishing the relatedness and creating a new pedigree or stud book for the breeding programme, because a lot of that information wasn't actually known. And so all of that preparatory work allowed us to then move forwards with a release project. With the Iberian lynx project, it was a slightly different situation where there weren't Iberian lynx in captivity, significant populations in captivity prior to the project started. So some of that work in the early days had to be done. And now there's many more lynx in captivity, and actually some of the surplus lynx are now being held within zoos in order to help manage that population in a demographically healthy way. So that's probably one of the key differences. I'm sure there's others. I'm just looking at some of the other questions. Somebody asked, how do you come to the figure of 20 cats per year? Not more or not less? Is it 10 females and 10 males? I think the evidence from reintroductions is that you should, for a reintroduction to be successful, you need to try and introduce as many animals as possible. So I think probably the simplest answer is that to some extent the number is a balance between what would be desirable, which would be many cats, and what's achievable realistically and feasibly within the kind of scope size of what is actually already quite a large breeding project, and the resources to track those cats and manage them. But it is also based on some modelling work, which suggests that for a population to be viable in the long run, you would need to have approximately 40 cats for that population to be viable, and the releases are kind of calculated around those figures. But that's modelling work, and models are always wrong. It's just a question of how wrong they are. So we're going to be learning a lot from what we're doing over the coming years that will inform our future release. But certainly the Iberian Lynx project now, which has been going for many years, has released over time many hundreds of individuals. How many kittens do they have? Is it different in captivity and in the wild? We don't know that really in detail, and the wildcats can have a whole range of kittens in our breeding centre, between 1 and 5, or 0 and 5, because sometimes cats don't produce successfully. And we don't really know enough about the differences in litter size in captivity in the wild, really, because it's quite hard to observe wild living wildcats. But that's maybe something that we will learn more about over time. Thanks, Fiona, for that question. Just trying to... Due to pressures on habitat, do you see wildcats only ever having a future within ring-fence protected wild areas? Thanks for that question, Amy. I think the short answer to that, I think, is no, because as explained, wildcats are a kind of habitat generalists, and they need a complex mosaic of woodland and forest edge habitat. So I think there's a lot of potential for wildcats to be recovered across larger tracts outside protected areas, but I think that depends on mitigating threats and obviously an ongoing programme of habitat improvement. But I think there's lots of real positivity about positive signs and trends around habitat recovery in Scotland at the moment. Obviously mentioned the Cairngorms Connect project, but there's real efforts to try and restore more areas of habitat across Scotland. And I'd like to see wildcat recovery helping to drive that and engage people with that in a way that maybe not everybody might be engaged simply with habitat recovery activities on their own. Because at the end of the day, the acid test of healthy connected ecosystems is whether they can maintain populations of carnivores and larger species, whether that's wildcats or we might be thinking about other species like salmon or golden eagles. All of these wide-ranging species tend to be much more complex in their habitat requirements. And so whether or not we can maintain them is kind of an acid test for habitat quality. Have you seen any genetic problems within the wildcat population, or have they managed to avoid this due to hybridisation? I think, thanks very much for that question, Sarah. I think the answer to that is we don't really know yet. So although we have done a lot of genetic research on wildcats, we don't really know what genes might control for what specific genetic traits or diseases in the way that we do, for example, in human populations, or perhaps in well-studied agricultural species like cattle or chickens. And I think this really is a really interesting point about whether hybridisation could bring benefits as well as disbenefits. So we assume on the whole that hybridisation is a bad thing because the two species are really evolutionarily quite different. And so our predictions would be that the animals would have a lower fitness in the environment. But there's also potential for some genetic benefits to be brought by hybridisation. I think one of the most obvious ones could be resistant to disease. But I think tellingly that disease is likely to be disease that is also carried by domestic cats. So we know that disease transfer from domestic cats is also a very big issue. But I don't think there's enough evidence on that at the moment. But certainly it's really important for diseases to be understood in the context of how that's impacting hybridisation. And we're doing a lot of work, baseline work and work on the release to try and get a better understanding of that. But we're certainly not there. I think going back to the question that somebody asked about lynx reintroductions, I think what's very clear is that any diseases that domestic cats bring to wildcats would also be a problem for lynx. And so I think domestic cats in the wild landscape and the diseases that they bring is a wider conservation problem than just for wildcats. And it's also, of course, a welfare problem as well for domestic cats. I'm just checking the time. I think we've maybe got time for 2 more quick questions. When assessing whether the wildcat population is viable, is it only wildcats that count, or can the hybrids make a contribution? Really good question. The modelling that's been done so far has just looked at wildcat populations. We haven't really got our heads around the idea of how we might parameterize a model that would look at hybrid contributions in this specific context. There are some models that have looked at that elsewhere. I think really for the moment, there's so many unknowns that we need to study and see what happens following the release before we kind of look at more complicated models of population viability. And as I said, they're a very useful tool for potentially predicting what might happen with a conservation translocation. But at the end of the day, they're only as good as the data that goes into the model. And so they need to also be used with caution. Jan, do you integrate some citizen science databases into monitoring the released cats? Not a huge amount. We do take records off the iRecord app and look at those in the context of wildcat monitoring. But we haven't done a huge amount with that within that actual release site. And one of the reasons for that is that we need to really get a very close handle on all of the cats that are out there, and spending time on identifying the camera trap images on the camera trap array. But certainly, anybody who would like to submit sightings of wildcats can do that, and there'll be a link on our website where you can find out how to do that. So certainly, if you think you have seen a wildcat, then we're always really interested to see those records. Right, I think that's probably taking us out of time, and thanks, Gemma, for posting that link. And so I think I'm going to just wrap up by saying, if you've enjoyed this talk or any other talks in the series, there's a whole load of them that are online, then please tune in this time next week to listen to Professor David Breeze's talk about what World Heritage Sites can do for you. So that'll be same time online next week. So hope you have a lovely rest of the afternoon. Bye.